I am in the role of the moderator, guiding us all through this conversation for the next 50 minutes, as you've heard, before we then actually warm up for a dinner. And I have with me this evening for our Russian Files conversation the following guests. We start first with Mr. Vyacheslav Nikonov, who is First Deputy Chairman, Committee on International Affairs of the State Duma. And I would like to kindly ask you to keep silent, please, because we really want to focus on the conversation. So he's from the Committee of International Affairs of the State Duma of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation. Then, actually, to my right is Mr. Manish Tewari, who is member of the parliament and member of the Indian National Congress. He has been also Minister of Information and Broadcasting between 2012 and 2014. Then we have also Mr. Fyodor Wojtolovsky, who is director of Primakov Institute of World Economy and International Relations of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and Mr. Ivan Timofeev, who is Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, Russia. So two think tankers. And last but not least I'm just following the list of participants, and certainly I do not want to overshadow the importance of our female participant Victoria Panova, who is head of BRICS Expert Council. She's also vice rector at the HSC University, and she's also responsible for what I've learned recently, Women 20 Russian Sherpa. So she's Sherpa for the women who are actually dealing with the G20 topics. Now, we will have 2 rounds of inputs from our panelists, and the idea, of course, is to have also a final session for questions, really questions, so that we get as much as possible, and no, long statements and comments. This is closed-door conversation and should be as open as possible. And I would like to start with Mr. Nikonov. My question to you is, give us a sense of the current political situation in Russia. Russia is having an election, presidential election on 17th of March. But then again, of course, it's the second anniversary of the war against Ukraine. So is this, in some sense, actually being perceived as any kind of factor for, let's say, popularity of the Russian president who is going to run again for president? Give us a sense of the political mood at home, popularity of the president, and also, given the fact that there have been some quite, I would say, big events. Last year we saw with the mutiny of Prigozhin, this year with the death of the oppositional leader Navalny. Is this in some sense kind of contributing, or isn't being perceived at all actually in the Russian society? So what is the political, let's say, landscape right now ahead of this election, and what will change in terms of political agenda after the election?
Thank you, Evelina. Actually, that's easy. To answer the first and second question of the agenda is to say that Putin's popularity in 2 years extended from 70% to 81%. And so the election is not a big deal. And nothing you mentioned can influence the outcome. So that's it. The mood of the society, for the first time ever, since the beginning of polling in Russia, more than 70% last month said that Russia is moving in the right direction. That is the highest ever. So I'll pass to, I'm terrible for moderators, since I try to answer all the questions put by the organizers of the conference, who are the Russia's closest partners, who does it lean on, and who does it trust. And I'll actually start with yesterday's comments of Mr. Mendelsohn, who came to India to talk about colonialism of Russia. To me, it was quite amazing. We are leaning, and we're friendly with all the civilizations which know what colonialism is, except one, which is the West. We are very close to the African civilization. They know what is colonialism. Belgium, French, German, Portuguese. They still remember blacks in the zoos of the all European cities up to the 50s, 1950s. We are leaning and we are close friends to the Latin American civilization. They also know much about colonialism. First Spanish and Portuguese, and then the Banana Republic. He is an SOB, but our SOB kind of diplomacy and big stick diplomacy. We are friendly and we lean to the Muslim world, which also knows a lot about colonialism and imperialism. These are 2 billion people. We are close and we are leaning to the civilization of Southeast Asia, which also knows something about colonialism. British, Dutch, French, American. We are leaning on and we're close to the great ancient civilizations, each of 1,400,000,000 people. I mean, India and China. So the answer to the question is any sovereign country which is not in the American orbit. That's the answer. And we know what colonialism means. Here in India, it's worthwhile reminding that India accounted for 27% of the global GDP before the British showed up. And then they had only 1.5% at the end of the 19th century. So, final question, is this the end of any Russian ambition to integrate with Europe? Is Peter the Great's project over, and should we think of Russia now as an Asian country? There were a few Russians who wanted to integrate with Europe, not all of them. Peter the Great's project was to make Russia a great power, and this project is still going on. We think of Russia as Russia, not as a European country, an Asian country. It's just Russia, a Russian civilization. In geographic terms, it's a Euro-Pacific power. We're a separate center of power, sovereign center of power, which is in good terms with all sovereign centers, which understand their national interest and actually which are not very happy with the short unipolar moment we were in after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, as simple as that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Allow us a little bit of suspense. We have still 40 plus minutes, and you just answered all the questions that the organizers provided, but trust me, I have some more. So, Mr. Tewari, let's move now to your sense of what actually, let's say, what was your impression over the last 2 years of the dynamics here in India, how the Indian population, also what kind of debates were in response and in reaction to the ongoing war against Ukraine. How was it perceived? What were the debates? What are your takeaways from these 2 years? What are your personal impressions from an Indian point of view?
Well, thank you very much. It seems I'm the odd person out in what looks to be a purely Western conversation. But allow me to share my 2 bits, whatever it is worth. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and its successor state, Russia, have traditionally and historically been a friend of India. And therefore, the government of India, that I do not speak for, wisely chose to take a fairly, if I can put it in those words, a neutral position in the entire conflict. But if you were to rewind back in time, India also had a long colonial experience. However, at the cusp of our independence, we decided that we'll not open a quarrel with the past because we didn't want to lose our future. And therefore, notwithstanding those 200 years of colonialism, we did decide to join the Commonwealth because we thought that you can't build a nation on bitterness. You can't build a future by holding grudges of the past. And therefore, in my humble estimation, as I had the privilege of opening the first debate in the Indian Parliament on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and when I look back over these 2 years, I cannot help but wonder what strategic objectives has this conflict achieved? Except for death and destruction and displacement all around, not limited to Ukraine, but also Russia, which I said has been a traditional and historical friend of ours. It confounds me completely as to how better placed Russia is today in the geopolitical context than it was on the 24th of February 2022, when this invasion or when this conflict commenced. And I cannot but help also rewind back to the Budapest Memorandum, when very explicit guarantees were given to Ukraine, which had the third largest nuclear arsenal at that point in time, that your territorial integrity would be guaranteed if you were to forsake your nuclear arsenal. What signal does this conflict send to smaller powers, which have larger powers as their neighbors, that the only guarantee of their territorial sovereignty and integrity is to actually have deterrence, which has the capacity of mass destruction? I think this is a question which we need to seriously ponder over, because it has the potential of absolutely destroying, and I use that word very carefully, the nuclear architecture of non-proliferation, which we never subscribed to in the first place, but which was very assiduously built by the P5 over the last 70 years. So therefore, from a purely Indian perspective, notwithstanding that we have been very large buyers of Russian oil over the past 24 months, I still have not been able to find an answer to that question. And I would like to be enlightened on it. as to what strategic objectives have the past 24 months really achieved. And I leave it at that.
Thank you very much also for being really, for keeping track of time. So we move to Mr. Wojtolowski, and I think that you can take on from here by giving us a sense of the economic situation in Russia. How has Russia been coping with, obviously, with the situations after the start of the war, and specifically in terms of relationships? We've heard about the example of, let's say, the purchase of Russian oil. What were the key pillars for the Russian economy to stabilize? Is it, has it stabilized? Just leave the Western sanctions a little bit away because your colleague is going to touch upon them, but give us a sense of the economic situation.
Thank you very much, Velina. It's a very interesting question, but I would like to shortly respond to what have Mr. Tewari said before. The conflict in Ukraine didn't start in 2022. It has started in 2014, when the Ukrainian government decided to use military power against their own population in eastern Ukraine. And it has been developing with Minsk agreements. Russia was trying to realize and strongly support it. I was part of this process. I know it from the beginning. And, the decision to start special military operation has been caused because our partners from the West didn't give any political guarantees to Minsk agreements. Europeans tried, but you know what they have finally said. You know what have Angela Merkel and François Hollande said, that it was cheating. For us, it was not cheating. We tried to resolve the conflict. But anyway, we are where we are. And, it's the biggest tragedy of Russian and Ukrainian people, because these nations are the closest brothers and friends used to be for decades, for centuries. And, we are where we are. And in current circumstances, we have to think how we would manage the situation after this conflict. So I would like not to be focused on conflict. Velina has asked me about economy. The paradox is that after thousands rounds of sanctions, Russia is doing good in its economy. And even the level of growth right now of GDP is, comparable to the global level of growth of GDP. It's about 3.5%. It's approximately the same level of growth as many developed countries are having. And we have the same level of growth of industrial production right now, about 3.5%. And the manufacturing industry is also doing good. We have about 7.5% of growth. Of course, military-industrial complex is playing a role in these figures and in this process, but what has changed? Russia is not only oriented on selling, oil and gas on global markets. Russia is much more interested to develop its industrial capabilities and to become one of global industrial producers, also for high tech. The second positive thing of this tragic situation of conflict in Ukraine, where Russians and Ukrainians are dying and killing each other, but because the West has decided to make Ukraine a proxy fighting against Russia, because they understand that the direct NATO-Russia conflict would cause the nuclear exchange. But also this situation has advantages and disadvantages. Another advantage for Russia, that it has decided to turn east and to develop its ties with its eastern partners. And the most significant economic partners for Russia right now are China and India. We have about 240 billions of dollars in our trade turnover with China, and this figure is growing. And we have got about 65 billion of trade turnover in goods, not only, but we also have figures in services, in goods with India. And this figure is also growing with fantastic speed. The third partner of Russia is still European Union. And you may like it or not, but our economies are still interconnected. And with EU, Russia is having more than 92 billions. It's more than with India, but for Russia, in political terms, it's less significant than trade and economic cooperation with India. But we still have 92 billion of our trade turnover with EU countries. And I think that the result that the United States have reached with supporting the Ukrainian conflict and provoking Kiev to not to have negotiations and to end this nightmare, but to fight against Russia as long and as hard as they can. But the main goal for the United States was to get oil and gas market of Europe. We had about 400 billion of trade turnover with Europe, with European Union before the Ukrainian crisis has started in 2014. Now we have only 92, but we're still working. Also, there is one more significant partner for Russia, which is also a member of NATO alliance and even supplying some weapons to Ukraine, is Turkey. We have about 65 billion of trade turnover with Turkey, and we are also developing our strong economic ties, trade, investment, social contacts. And Turkey decided to have more balanced positions than EU country did, even those who used to be the most significant partners of Russia, like Netherlands, like Germany, like France, and many others. Only Hungary and Slovakia are still keeping, more or less independent position, but they're still joining sanctions regime of European Union. But Turkey decided not to join it. And we are flying through Turkey around the globe. We're working with Turks in many spheres. And I think that our government and our nation is very grateful for this, wider horizon of thinking of Turkish. It's not only pragmatism. They're trying to play the role which Finland, Sweden have been playing during the Cold War, and being the window from the west to the east. So the paradox is that the more pressure on Russia the West will have, the more self-confident and more oriented to diversify its economic development and its economic ties Russia will be. This is very, very strange situation, but it works for Russia much more than against Russia. Thank you.
And we move to Mr. Timofeev, who will give us an overview of the sanctions policy in a more detailed way. As we speak, if we take a look at the numbers, since the beginning of the war up until now, the European Union with its members is still buyer number one of Russian fossil fuels with almost 190 billion. And China and India obviously are following suit and will be probably overtaking next year. So how has Russia, so to say, bypassed Western sanctions? Can you give us some concrete examples? And also how has Russia adapted to the sanctions regime, given the fact that as we speak, in 2 days from now, we will, we, the Europeans, will introduce 13 package on Russia, actually on the day of the second anniversary.
Thank you very much. As we call it, putting another package with a package with packages. First, the number of sanctions which are being imposed against Russia has few precedents in the recent history. So it's really a big number, and all the possible sanctions instruments are now being used against Russia: blocking financial sanctions, export control, trade sanctions, bans on import, new instruments like oil cap, and many others, transportation sanctions, visa, etc. So one of the major consequences is that sanctions distort normal market relations. We used to have normal market relations with the West and with our friends in other regions. So now these normal market relations are being distorted, are being politicized, and in the past, our relations could be characterized as economic interdependence. So now, up to now, this economic interdependence has been weaponized, and sanctions is a major instrument to weaponize it. As for the situation on the ground, Russian economy had been quite significantly integrated into the global one. And the first impression after the start of the sanctions tsunami was that this level of integration would lead to the inevitable collapse of the economy. So it's impossible to survive being so integrated into the global supply chains, into the global trade, into the global finance, etc., etc. But surprisingly to many, the economy survived. The government managed to maintain the financial stability. Actually, it's Russian national sport to criticize central bank and the Ministry of Finance. So each and every like to do it, well, almost every day. But into doubt that it was these two institutions which made their homework to the best extent. For instance, the central bank for 8 years had been working on the national payment system. Imagine what could we have if we don't have our own autonomous payment, right? So, and again, the second national sport was to laugh on the Russian mirror cards. So they had been considered as something irrelevant in comparison with Visa and MasterCard. But then it turned out that this helped to manage the economy, to manage the financial system. Another consequence was that, quite surprisingly, Russian industry showed quite good results in the sense that it started to replace the Western companies which are leaving. So this is not just the Chinese friends who are coming, the friends from India, from Brazil, from other countries, but the local producers. And the image of local producers had been terrible. So now it turned out that yes, the price may be bigger, the quality may be lower, but it's much better than zero. One significant factor, crucial factor, I would say, that Russian economy is a market one. My point is that if Russian economy had been the Soviet one, the kind of was over-centralized, directly planned, etc., it would have already collapsed. But it hadn't. The market is flexible. The entrepreneurs have the will to survive. Otherwise, they will perish as businesses. Do sanctions harm? Yes, they do. They increase outlays. They slow down the modernization in a number of industries. However, on the other hand, they stimulate the development on other grounds, and the less the interdependence with our former partners in the West is, the less ways to politicize sanctions and to use them as a leverage. So this leverage is getting less. So now we are expecting the 13th package. And what would we see there? We will see, 200 more of blocked persons. So what else? What else? I wouldn't say that sanctions are over. I would never dismiss their impact, negative impact on economy. But actually, the adaptation is going on, and the life is going on too. Thanks.
Thank you. And finally, we would like to hear from Ms. Panova, your insight on the ongoing developments, and there have been quite a lot regarding BRICS. With the last summit in South Africa, and obviously now it's a big year for Russia because the BRICS summit is also taking place in Russia, in Kazan. Also, it's in an expanded form, and obviously, if we take a look at the new members, Russia has solid relationships with with them already. So what is your view on the priorities that Russia sets on the BRICS, and what will be the, let's say, key deliverable that Russia wants also from this specific format? How is it also that Russia successfully manages two, let's say, almost impossible members, China and India, within this format?
Thank you so much, Felina. But allow me to, I will be answering your question, but at the same time disagreeing a bit with what Fodor has said earlier. Which was that we started turning to the east and to the south only over the past years, but what's been happening with BRICS is exactly the sign that this was the long process. It started for quite some time. It didn't connect to any geopolitical tensions. Yes, those expedited this change, but on the other hand, with this very short period when we had after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when there was over-reliance and over-enthusiasm with the West, very soon after, Russian elite and Russian people realized they don't want to continue turning their back on the other peoples of the world. West is not everything. It's not the only family we would like to be in. We're very much comfortable, and probably sometimes more comfortable, with the other parts of the world, with the other peoples. We had long and trusted and very solid relations with India. We are good friends with China, the whole of Latin America, Africa, etc. So Russia started its way. If you look at the documents, probably it will be early 2000s and late 1990s. And BRICS became a kind of a showcase of how Russia sees this new model together with its partners in the BRICS of the world, of the new relations. And I think this is important because the key principles of BRICS, and this is what's been lacking when we were talking to our Western partners or other countries were doing the same, a bit of a, the superiority with which we were looked at. Although Russia is a civilization, what Dr. Nikonov has said at the very beginning, India is a civilization, China is a civilization. So there was much more comfortable situation and many more priorities and things that we had in common and we had together. And the good part about BRICS that we agreed to be diverse. We agree that our opinions do not go hand in hand together. It's a common knowledge that we are in conflict with the West at the moment. China has troubled relations with the United States, but it doesn't bring this over to the whole of BRICS. BRICS is not against anybody. BRICS has a constructive and positive agenda. And this is why, even during those geopolitical times, when many countries were seeing pressure from the outside not to have friends with Russia, not to be friends with China, they still opted to be part of BRICS. And we're not just talking about it becoming twice as big, right? There is about 17 official applications. And there are a couple dozens more countries that express their interest to be in a closer contact with with this mechanism. And for Russia's presidency this year, Russia's chairship, the slogan is strengthening multilateralism for equitable global development and security. That means it's equal and equitable for all. And it also means that it's a comprehensive mechanism which would be dealing with political, economic, and humanitarian issues. And what we saw, and in fact, there was never an interruption in deliberations in BRICS. We're having a very extensive program, over 200, in fact, events that will be held. And a great deal of it, and this has been feature from the very start, is their people-to-people contacts. So a lot of it's not brought from top to down. It's not from the government. The government official track, they have their own life. But what is important, that we feel comfortable with each other, talking with each other. And that is why a lot of initiatives that we are having, they come on a people-to-people level. Some of them being born at the grassroots, they go to the top. And let's see, like NDB is one of the cases when it actually came out of there as a bold idea of experts and just became true just within 2.5 years after the first pronouncement of this as pure words. So what would be the main thing which Russia would be responsible for, as I see, and or many of us see? As a result of Johannesburg summit, so we have 5 more members, and it is very important to ensure the smooth integration of those, to have and to remain and to see BRICS as an official mechanism, because we saw not a talk shop, we saw a lot of concrete projects. So it is vital that the newcomers, they feel at home and at ease, and they integrate in those projects at all levels, be it official, be it track 2 or track 3. That's number one. And number two, it's also been mentioned as an important point during South African chairship, and this was touched upon by all the Russian speakers. This is about how West was using instruments that we thought cannot be politicized. For example, the dollar, which became weaponized, and the financial system. So this is important for BRICS to come with an independent payment instrument, not against the West, once again, not against the United States, but in order to ensure their own sustainable, equitable development, trade, and interactions with each other. So those, I would say, is their 2 main points, with the many more smaller issues that would be on the agenda.
Thank you very much. Now we have 12 minutes for Q&A, and please let us give the opportunity to as many participants as possible. So refrain from long comments, but really be specific with specific questions. So we have a gentleman in the second row. Who else would like to ask a question? Yes? Okay, good. Let's start with the first round. I will gather a few questions, and depending on the flexibility of our participants to keep it short in their answers, we may have a second round.
Davor Kunc, I work for the European Investment Bank in Luxembourg, otherwise from Croatia. Thanks a lot. It was interesting to hear the numbers. I particularly noted the decline in trade with the EU from, if I remember correctly, 400 billion to 95. I was wondering what is the structure of the remaining 95 billion? So what is it that you still trade with the EU? And the second question, I noted your point on modernization being affected by the sanctions. These effects are usually not visible in the short term. I'm wondering how do you see the consequences of the lack of modernization in the medium to long term if the sanctions go on, and if there are any other such longer term consequences which might not be visible in the short term. Thanks.
Thank you. Just a second, we will collect a few more questions and then the panel can answer. We saw a lady here. I think there was another lady on this side. No? Okay, and then a gentleman there. Yeah, okay.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alexandra Borisova from IMAMO Research Fellow. My question will be to Mr. Manish Tewari. Although I'm very much agree to the most things you were saying here. I have a short question about the guarantees you mentioned. So Fedor mentioned Minsk agreements, but I wanted to go even further and ask about how about NATO guarantees after the collapse of Soviet Union. So what you said that India would not rely on the past and past grudges. What would India do if its key military rival, on the one hand, declares the end of the arms race, and on the other hand, takes 12 countries to the biggest military organization in the world? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And then the gentleman there, and I think there was yes, and we gather also your question, and then we leave it up to the participants to answer. Yes, please.
Torsten Benner from the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. I'll resist the temptation to comment on the spectacular narratives we've been served before dinner and ask a question to Mr. Wojtolowski. You said we should focus on the aftermath. We shouldn't focus on the past and this conflict, on the aftermath. So how do you look at the aftermath? What are options in your mind? How does the outcome of the US elections inform your thinking on this? I'd be really curious.
Okay, that's great. And the gentleman in the corner, please.
Yes, hope this works. Hello, thank you very much for your comments. I'm Marcin Bozanski from the Warsaw Security Forum. We've known some of the participants here from previous times when we had chances to discuss, so I'll be very interested to hear a few things. First of all, please, if you could answer to the question to the Indian gentleman in the panel. I think it wasn't unanswered. What is the strategic objective here with the war which is waged on Ukraine? Because we don't really see that in any way. We'd like to hear your views, see your thinking. Second question, and this is maybe to the lady in the panel, what is the feeling among the Russian population in terms of the casualties that the war is taking? Is there any pushback towards the government, meaning that if the war doesn't have any sense, or what's the feeling about it, how much life can it cost of the Russian population, and what are they willing to sort of keep as a resilience to that? And the third question on the economic front. How can Russia's economic relations be trusted if the fundamentals of law are so bent in the realm of international law in terms of the deals that are being made? I think that has been raised here, but we'd want to understand that better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So unfortunately, we will not have a second round of Q&A. We have plenty of questions. We've heard, I will wrap it up for our participants, and it's up to the participants to decide on which questions to elaborate, how actually we have moved from 400 billion to 92 billion. And then there was a question about how the long-term implications on the lack of modernization are going to be compensated, most likely by relations with countries like, for instance, China. Then we had a concrete question for Mr. Tewari about which I suppose you are going to elaborate on. We have a question specifically for Mr. Wojtolowski about the aftermath options. Of course, then there is a question about the strategic objectives, and I would like to also ask specifically Mr. Nikonov about the one concrete deliverable that we will see in the next mandate of the Russian president. If there is already one concrete, specific new goal that's been, let's say, elaborated and we could not know from outside. And BRICS was also mentioned. I mean, in this case, I would like to hear also a little bit about this new payment system, whether there are already concrete details being discussed as to how this payment system will look like, because what we get from, let's say, outside is not very transparent in a sense that it's still not clear what kind of payment system this is going to be based on national currencies, based on specific currency model, and so on and so forth. So, and then, of course, the economic front and the casualties. Yeah. I would like to start with Mr. Nikonov first, and then actually we move to Mr. Tewari, and then we will engage the think tankers in the panel. Thank you.
So I'll take the modernization stuff. It's going on much faster than you may expect, especially due to the military production. That's where modernization is really taking place, and very rapidly inside Russia. And actually the West never provided Russia with high tech. And now there are more scientists in China than in the whole Western world taken together, by the way. As for strategic goals is to have Ukraine as it was designed by Ukrainian people in the Ukrainian constitution as a non-aligned country, not weaponized with American nukes, no foreign bases there. And that was something we really wanted, because for Russia, the Ukraine in NATO is an existential threat. That's what we said for decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because in this case, any conflict would mean using nuclear threshold going to zero at the very beginning of the conflict. So for us, it's really serious and very existential. Even more, much more than, say, Russian missiles in Cuba back in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this military conflict is regarded by Russians as absolutely justified. The casualties, well, there are casualties in war, but Russians for the first time really support the government wholeheartedly, except for 20% which are not supporting. And most of these 20% think Putin is too liberal, actually. It doesn't use enough weaponry against Ukraine. As for law, sanctions is the most illegal thing. Sanctions is something United Nations can only impose. Security Council. Sanctions are absolutely illegal. And what you did with the Russian foreign exchange reserves? Where is legality? There is nothing of legality left. And you are not, and the West actually is not using the terms law, the rules-based order. You know, there is a legal order in normal societies, and the rules-based it's from the criminal world. It's mafia. No one ever saw the rules. There are laws for the society and rules for mafia.
You know, ever since the end of the Second World War, perhaps the world has entered its most dangerous phase. And the reason why I say that is because you are looking at a three-continent conflict playing itself out simultaneously. You have the Russian-Ukrainian conflict now in its 729th day, if you do not rewind back to 2014, and you know there could be contested narratives about 2014. And then you have the situation between Israel and Hamas, a horrific terror attack, which was then succeeded by the most brutal form of collective punishment which could be imposed on a people. And then you have the standoff between India and China, which is now almost in its fourth year, in its 45th month, and the perennial tensions in the South China Sea. So the question is that, does this call for statespersonship, or does it call for stepping on the accelerator? And I think that in the 21st century, the age of expansionism is over. And those who believe in expansionism in any form actually live in a medieval mindset, if I can put it as bluntly as possible. And so, therefore, you asked about, you know, the eastward expansion of NATO. I was there at the Munich Security Summit in 2007 when President Putin made that speech. The fact is that, you know, we've had problems with two of our neighbors now going back 70 years, with Pakistan, right, which has been sponsoring terror now for close to 3 decades, with China, which has transgressed into our borders and continues to be there now, as I said, for over 45 months. The question is that should we then get into a hot shooting war with them? Is that really going to be, or that should be the way forward? Or the way forward should be to try and find a modus vivendi, to see that you can find a resolution to this conflict. Because at the end of the day, it is people who pay the price for conflict. And I think Russia and Ukraine are classical examples. Obviously, numbers remain secret, but going by whatever is there in the public space, casualties on both sides have been pretty horrific. There are lots of wounded. The levels of internal displacement in Ukraine is something which Europe has not seen after the Second World War. So is this the future which Europe or the world would like to envisage for itself? I think is a question which people need to ask themselves very, very seriously. And let me close by saying that I don't condone the eastward expansion of NATO, but is the answer to that eastward expansion getting into a shooting war with your neighbor? And I leave it to your wisdom to decide.
Thank you very much. Now, let's go to Ms. Panova, and then we move to Mr. Timofeev, and in the end, we do it now in the, in the opposite order. Thank you. Please keep it as short as possible because our time is already up.
Okay, so with regards to casualties, obviously there are casualties, as Dr. Nikolov has said, and it's a real tragedy for every family that has it. But if you once again, and both speakers, both Dr. Nikolov and Dr. Vitalovsky have mentioned it, this has come out not in 2022, and in fact, and there were casualties before, and if you look at the situation, which you might be not knowing well from the inside, but it is avoiding much bigger civilian casualties with the special military operation that Russia is holding now. And also, if you look at how population is looking at it, even the poll that was held by University of Chicago, 64% of Russian population sees this conflict in Ukraine as a civilizational struggle between Russia and the West and support it. Of course, Russian opinion polls would show higher figures, but that's already a big show from the outsider.
So, if you follow the whole political narrative, we will spend here the endless time, right? So, just let's be careful about following the narrative in general.
Yeah. Well, this is very interesting. We just had an excellent conversation about with our German colleagues from the European Parliament, the German Parliament here, about reparations, and actually being that there have been differences, of course, from governments, and that although legally this is closed, they're still potentially to be owned. But this is a fascinating thing that you raised, because it made me again come back to think about Russia and the Russian society and where can it be. And the last time that a country applied the type of policies that Russia does during international affairs was with the Nazi regime. And I'm taking completely emotions out of it in terms of just the modus operandi of certain military conquest and what international affairs should be based on. So there's in that sense there is a chance for Russia, if that regime type is broken, then for the society perhaps to grow. Don't you think so?
No, of course not. Getting back to World War II, Russia faced not only Germany, it was again United Europe. Again, I'm saying that because for Napoleon also brought United Europe. More than half of Napoleonic forces were not French, quite a sizable Polish segment in his troops. As for Hitler, he also brought the whole Europe. There were Italians, there were Poles, by the way, there were French, there were Spaniards, there were, of course, Finnish troops. Actually, blockade of Leningrad was a Finnish affair. They're Hungarians, they were Romanians, Czech Republic did not exist, it was part of Germany, as you know, and they were producing the nice German tanks. Austria was a part of Germany, and it was supplying Hitler with everything. Actually, every single European Union country now, with the United Kingdom out, were either the Third Reich, the friends of the Third Reich, supporters of the Third Reich, or countries which sent troops to Russia. So we have some historic memories which are different from yours. Peter the Great was fighting Charles the 12th on Poltava, which is in the middle of Ukraine. What was he doing there? Peter the Great was expanding to Ukraine. Was it part of Russia at this time? And what the Swedes were doing there? They had, the strongest European army at this time, which was defeated. Russia never invaded Europe. Europe invaded Russia many times.
On the 17th of September 1939. Yes.
Sorry?
Yes, on the 17th of September 1939. Yes.
We never invaded Europe. We actually, at this point, as you well know, the question for Russia was very clear: where the German troops are going to stop at this time, and they stopped at the old Russian border. That's what was. It was not Russia attacking somebody. So history, of course, can prove whatever. But I can tell you that historically, Russia feels very vulnerable from the Western side. And of course, that was regarded as existential. Much more existential, as I've said. They sent the Russian missiles on Cuba. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Americans were ready to blow up Russia, the Soviet Union then, with their nukes. And actually, the situation, if we're looking for parallels, looking from our viewpoint, it's like, Texas seceding from the United States, and then Russians masterminding a regime change in Texas, then bringing forces there, and then arming Texas, then Texas starting the war with those who don't want to secede from the United States, and Americans doing nothing. I don't think so. I don't think they will do something. So, and as I've said, when the American forces showed up there, when the British naval bases were built on the Black Sea shore, that was regarded as an existential threat to Russia. And if a country regards something as existential threat, and it has a right to regard it as such, it acts militarily. And that's what happened, actually. And we could not tolerate 8 more years of killing of Russians in eastern Ukraine, which was what they were doing there. They killed a few thousand children there. So that was not that simple. And speaking about the parallels in which some countries, for us, the movement of NATO to the Russian borders was actually equivalent to the extension of the Fourth Reich. So that is our analogy on the situation.
I don't know. I was just intrigued since we have decided to walk down the tortured paths of history. I think one thing Russia can take comfort in is that anyone who's tried to invade Russia has ended up being unsuccessful. Whether it was Napoleon Bonaparte or it was Adolf Hitler when he decided to break the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And so therefore, under those circumstances, this, and I speak purely for myself, this this perceived existential threat that we talk about, is this a perception, or is this a reality? Because ultimately, I don't think anybody in their right minds, and even if you were a NATO on an expansionist path, you would really go down the very, very dangerous path of trying to invade Russia, because the entire logic of the Cold War was that if it does break out, the war would be fought on the North German plain. And ultimately, what really led to the reorganization of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic was not a hot war. It was an economic collapse. And if you were to rewind back to Germany between 1933 and 37, German GDP grew by 55%. And then you had the war, which led to the complete devastation of not only Germany but the rest of Europe. So under those circumstances, I'm not very sure as to whether this existential threat argument is really very convincing.
Yes, thank you very much. Good evening. As a German and former NATO official, I will not ask any questions about the war now, but a very direct, short question is about Navalny. And I was wondering why Russia is not releasing the body of Navalny to his own family. So, pure humanitarian question. Thank you.
Thank you. As another German, I want to ask one question regarding the war. So my question is, like, as I understood your argument correctly, there is kind of the understanding that Ukraine joining NATO would be an existential security threat to Russia, but something that has happened in reaction to the Russian invasion to Ukraine was that actually one country joined NATO that has a direct border to Russia, Finland. So my question is, out of understanding, what makes the Finnish case different from Ukraine? Thank you.
Are you trying to ask whether Russia will invade Finland, or it's just? Very, very bad joke, bad Eastern European joke. The joke aside, I would like really to ask on a serious note, whether, because I am personally not convinced that it's really only about Ukraine. I'm convinced that if, let's assume, and as far as I understood, there is this conviction that Russia is on a winning route. I'm not convinced that it's going to end in Ukraine. In fact, if we take a look at not just the concept of Peter the Great, but also the Ruski Mir concept, which is now very, very strongly propagandized, I don't think that Russia is ending in Ukraine, that Russia will actually have much bigger ambitions for itself in the direct neighborhood. So where is this stopping? Let's assume that Russia wins what it was aiming to win in Ukraine. Is it stopping there? Stopping the territorial expansion of Russia, because as we speak right now, Russia controls around 17% of a foreign country. 17% is an immense territorial expansion. Just if you take a look at the map, and for those who are not familiar with the map, this is the second largest European state. It's big to the extent that it overshadows small size European countries already. This is huge, even if we just consider the factors of territorial expansion, population, and by the way, also the access to critical raw materials, which are also there. So is this enough? Or is it more to this, what we are going to see in the years to come?
Getting back to legality, there is a principle of territorial integrity of countries in the United Nations Charter, and there is a right to self-determination. And they contradict each other. Though there was a ruling of the Security Council back in 1971, which specifies the limits of territorial integrity. Territorial integrity of the country where the government represents the whole nation. And that was not the case in Ukraine, definitely not after the unconstitutional coup organized in 2014. The eastern areas of Ukraine, they did not regard the new power in Kiev to be legitimate. And Kiev started the war against them. So from the point of view of international law, the sovereign will of the people living some places also matter. It's called democracy. People in Crimea had their will expressed in the referendum. People in some other areas of Ukraine couldn't do that because they were shelled. And actually Russia was prepared to keep territorial integrity of Ukraine if Kiev provides some rights to the people in East Ukraine, but they preferred to breed the new generation of Ukrainians or Russians who were ready to kill Russians because they speak Russian. And they were shelling Donetsk, Lugansk for years. So from this point of view, Russia's actions can be regarded as in absolute accordance with international law. As for where we go and Ruski Mir, the concept of Ruski Mir, as I know it, maybe you know better, it's actually a self-identity of individuals. If people identify somebody himself as a part of Ruski Mir, he is or she is there, and that's it. So it's again the will of the people. It's not about expanding somewhere. I don't think there are any people in Russia. I don't know exactly. I cannot guarantee 100% of Russian people because we have diversity of views and we have some people who may have some imperial ambitions. I don't know. But I don't know them in the government or in the parliament. And I don't think that anyone would be interested in messing up with NATO. The problem is that when you're in NATO, you're not really asked whether your territory can be used for example, for deploying nuclear warheads or not. That's the problem. For us, it was. People have right to self-determination. People in Eastern Ukraine also has this right. Where we go, wars are unpredictable, actually. But I would agree with Fyodor, the longer war, the smaller Ukraine.
I'm sorry, could you answer the questions that were asked?
Which is?
On Navalny.
Oh, Navalny, as far as
Finland.
I know, I'm not an expert on criminal investigations, but it really takes time. If there is a suspicion of a criminal death, not a natural death, then it takes time to investigate. And after this, the body is given to the family. There is a standard procedure. I'm not sure for how long, but it may take a couple of weeks, I think. Usually. Sorry?
Think there was a third person involved in the death of Navalny?
I don't know. I don't know.
Concerning the...
We protest.
I'm sorry. Concerning
definitely not Russia, not Russian state.
Concerning the question about Finland joining NATO, I think it's a disaster not only for Russia, it's a disaster for Finland. Because Finland used to be the most trusted partner of Soviet Union and then of Russian Federation in the West. And it has been going like this since 1950s, since Kekkonen government decided to have its own Eastern policy and to have dialogue with Soviet Union. And then current Finnish, nowadays Finland used to have the most trusted and very good economic, political, security relations with Russia. Current government decided to join NATO. Okay, it is respected by Russia because Finland was always part of the West, and it doesn't pose any direct pressure for Russia's security, but of course, it will influence on our military planning, unfortunately. It didn't include Finland, but it includes all NATO countries. Right now, the situation has changed. Finland is in NATO. Russian military officials and generals have to put Finland inside, the whole map of our military planning. The situation in Ukraine is very different, because it has been going through the period of, significant breakdown inside the country, and on political, on ideological level, and there are more than 4 million of Ukrainians who decided to move to Russia and to live there. I do not mean Donbass. I do not mean Crimea. I mean refugees after 2014. 4 million of Ukrainians preferred not the West, but Russia to live there. And a lot of Ukrainians are living in Donbass, a lot of Ukrainians controlled by Russia, and a lot of Ukrainians, ethnical Ukrainians, are living in Crimea, and they are comfortable with it. And they feel themselves much safer in Russia than being attacked by their own government like they used to be since 2014 till 2022. Of course, it's tragedy that we have this, break with our Ukrainian brothers. Russians are used to be brothers for centuries, as I mentioned before. For example, my family and my ancestors is from Kiev, and my great-grandfather was, correspondent, military correspondent of Kievskaya Mysl newspaper more than a century ago. But now we are where we are with Ukrainians, and NATO and the United States and other NATO countries did all the best they could to support Ukraine fighting against Russia and to support this conflict as sustaining, burning conflict, and still keeping there. That's the tragedy.
Fyodor, on the Finland thing, you lost me there because you said one was an identity answer, but we don't give an identity answer to real existential threats that you outlined before if Ukraine became a member of NATO. The nuclear threshold going to 0 applies to the Finnish border as well. So I don't fully understand, and we had 4 decades of Cold War with the nuclear threshold to 0. Yes, it were your extended dominions that were in the line of fire, Germany in that, or Eastern Germany in that case. But I don't fully get this logic. What's the difference between the Finnish Russian border and the nuclear threshold going to 0, and the Ukrainian? And what explains the difference in terms of hard security? I don't fully. I don't fully get the stark difference.
I do not understand your question because the nuclear threshold is still on the same level as it used to be before the Ukrainian crisis. If you look attentively to Russian military doctrine, if you look to the strategic planning document on nuclear planning, the positions are still the same. The only reason for Russia to use nuclear weapons is existential threat to this statehood.
You misunderstood me. I didn't mean to imply any change, but you said because of the existential threat that Ukraine and NATO would pose, it would kind of reduce the nuclear threshold to 0 in any sort of conflict. And okay, then I misunderstood. That's my bad. But I still don't get the Finland-Ukraine difference. You really lost me there.
So the question is, should Russia start military operation in Finland? Why it is not starting? That's the question, yes? That's the question.
Yes, why is
No, the question is why you are in Ukraine. That is one question.
Actually, I would disagree that Finland in NATO does not change the equation. It adds to Russian fears and to Russian arguments that NATO is an existential threat to Russia.
We have 5 minutes more, and then I will be the nasty moderator who is going to kick out everyone from the venue because there will be a next session and they need to prepare for it.
So I was just asking, how would NATO be an existential threat for Russia? Would you see NATO countries invading Russia?
Have you seen plans of Donald Trump's administration to deploy intermediate and short-range ground-based nuclear missiles in Europe? Have you seen them? What Russia has responded? It has suggested moratorium. And what Biden administration did, they are keeping this moratorium but not supporting it. But military people are thinking in categories of capabilities, not intentions. We do not know who will come or in the next elections, and if they will decide to deploy ground-based nuclear, intermediate and short-range nuclear missiles in Europe, the situation will be absolutely different, and it will be much more dangerous than it is now.
But just in terms of, entertainment.
May I just for a moment? May I just for a moment? If somebody does decide to go nuclear, does it really matter whether it's short range, intermediate, or long range? I mean, if you've really taken a decision, if you've really taken a decision to take a first shot, then it doesn't really matter as to from where do you fire the shot.
Yeah, of course, it leaves you more time for decision making. So it really matters a lot. As for first of all, what is important, first place, is NATO as perceived as existential threat. So that's important. American perceived Russian missiles in Cuba as existential threat. Yes? So that was important. They perceived it like that because there was no existential threat to the United States, but they perceived like that, and that mattered. That's one thing. Another thing, we are carefully reading American doctrinal documents. National security concept, nuclear posture, and all other things. We carefully read all the NATO documents, and we see that Russia is the number one enemy, and all the military planning of an alliance, which accounts for 80% of global military expenditures, is aimed at us. How can we regard it differently? You see? And thirdly, we have good intelligence.
On that note, let's agree that most likely we are going to meet again in a year, discussing most of these issues, unfortunately. And I wish you all, of course, more and more constructive conversations outside of this venue and obviously in all the rest of panel discussions. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for attending this discussion. Thank you for the frank and open statements of our Russian panelists. And thank you also for the patience of our Indian participant who gallantly accompanied this conversation and tried to some extent even to lower the temperature of it. And with that note, I wish you a pleasant evening and good night on my side.